In recent years, election seasons have been getting longer and with more overlaps between state, local, and federal. So, as Boston gets ready for a city election this year, it's not too soon to think about a race for governor next year. The first candidate has already announced, a former Democratic state senator, originally from Pittsfield. He's an executive with a community solar energy company and currently living in East Boston. We'd like to welcome Ben Downing. Thank you very much for being with us, Ben.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Ben, it seems that here you are, you were this prodigy state senator at age 24. You leave it all behind. Now you want to come back. So why?
Well, I left in the first time because I term limited myself. I made a promise to myself and voters when I first ran for office that if I was lucky enough to be given 5 terms, 10 years serving Pittsfield and the other 51 communities, that I would only seek those 5 terms. I think it's important to bring new people, new ideas, new energy to office. I by no means think I have all the best ideas, and I think it's important to have a refresh from time to time. And I've enjoyed my time working for Nexamp, trying to make clean energy accessible to everyone, everywhere. But I also, from that vantage point, have seen our state government lose the sense of urgency that I believe it needs to make progress on the big challenges that we face on climate, on economic and racial justice.
Well, I'm sure somebody with your background might be looking at what just happened in Texas, and I know not all of that applies to Massachusetts, but in terms of if not so much policy as mindset, what's the main takeaway from that in here in Massachusetts?
Yeah, it's that we've actually got to have a clear and consistent planning process. So there has been a move to, the market function being sort of the be all and the end all when it comes to our larger energy grid. And while the market has an important role to play to make sure we get the most efficient resource, too often that is stripped out the long-term planning function. And I think, unfortunately, that's what we're seeing in Texas with the shortcoming of the electric grid there. We can have a fully renewable electric grid that provides the resiliency that we need, but there's got to be a planning component to that. That was missed in Texas, and unfortunately, our friends and family there are suffering for it. And hopefully, that suffering will end soon.
Well, here in Massachusetts, we've also, but as you certainly are well aware, focused very much on the racial divide, the income divides. But it's not just a past year. You go back in your own statements going back 3 or 4 years, you're looking at this mismatching economy, the inequity and the tax burden. Um, so what does that mean in your campaign message for governor?
Yeah, I guess what it means and what I'd like to think that it means is that Massachusetts has the potential, right? The potential to be a fairer, stronger state. But we need to find a way to make the investments in our communities that will close those gaps, that will close our growing wage gap, that will close the wealth gap, and in particular, the racial wealth gap that in Suffolk County leads to the average white family having a median wealth of $247,000 and the average black family having a median wealth of $8, right? We have an uneven economy within areas that are prosperous, and we have an uneven economy across the state. In Western Massachusetts, in Pittsfield, where I grew up, young kids are told study hard and get out too often. We started to reverse that to a degree, but that was the message we got growing up. And yet we've got folks flocking to Eastern Mass, putting a strain on our housing market and our infrastructure. We can grow our economy and create opportunity for everyone in every corner of the state, but we have to take on tough challenges to do that. We have to make investments in our communities, and we've got to build a fairer, stronger state that.
Well, I think what we'd expect to hear from maybe more than one Democratic candidate is, they like to see higher taxes on people with really high incomes, get more money for education and some other things as well. But is it practical to do that now? I mean, there's all this scary talk now about businesses leaving, companies downsizing. Can we afford to increase the tax burden on the high end?
So we have seen, even during an economic downturn like this, the wealthiest in our communities have continued to accumulate more and more wealth. Their share of the economy has gone up. So yes, I believe we can ask more of those who have benefited from economic growth over the previous decades to make the investments in their communities that will make this a fairer, stronger state. And to that argument of it's not the right time now, when the economy starts to grow, we'll be told, oh, it's not the right time now. The economy's growing. We can't ask more of people right now. And then that is how you get into a generational position like where we are in Massachusetts now, where for 2 or 3 decades, we have not made the investments that would build a fairer, stronger state and that would close some of those gaps we've talked about.
Well, one thing you certainly gotten the hang of since you moved to East Boston is how bad traffic congestion can get. What do you see going forward, and what needs to be done about things like that?
The number one thing we can do to tackle congestion is to invest in transit, to make transit, both bus and train, both commuter rail and the MBTA, reliable, affordable, and efficient. Right? We need to make those investments for climate. We need to make it for our economy. Then we also need to be willing to use new tools like congestion pricing to send different signals to folks so that they can alter their travel patterns. Unfortunately, what we have seen in the previous 6 years under the Baker administration is either delay on these issues or a doubling down of the reliance on passenger vehicles as being the only way that people get around. I love electric vehicles. We want to see more electric vehicles if we're going to solve climate change. But the best thing we can do if we're going to solve climate change and build a more resilient economy is to invest in transit and to make it the reliable resource that everyone can build their lives around.
And what about raising Uber and Lyft fees, something that Governor Baker had a problem with?
Absolutely should be a part of it.
What about education? I know that there have been attempts to increase the state's chipping in on that, but also maybe to get some of the public schools to do a better job of turning things around. Between those two things, what would you like to see?
I think you need to do both. I don't think it's an either or. And I think, again, the lack of urgency on education is another area where we are not able to close gaps quickly enough. We passed the Student Opportunity Act in Massachusetts, thanks to Senator Chang Diaz and others' leadership. That's phased in over 7 years. A kid who's in middle school by the time when that was signed into law will be in the workforce or in college by the time it's fully implemented. And that's only because we don't want to ask more of the wealthiest in our communities to be able to fund those investments that we need to make. So yes, we need more equitable funding of K through 12. We need universal early education and childcare, and we need to reduce the cost of public higher education so it's a better option for folks who'd like to go there.
What about healthcare? Certainly, the pandemic has made us more aware of the disparities, even though we have this sort of robust and fairly inclusive kind of situation in Massachusetts. How would you like to see that changed?
So I think there are a variety of things that we can take on when it comes to healthcare. First, we need to continue to do everything we can to reduce the cost of care. We need to continue to improve access. One of the things that COVID has shown us is that if we are not intentional in our outreach, in particular to communities of color, that there will continue to be persistent healthcare inequities, persistent gaps in the outcomes in the delivery of our healthcare system. We've seen it with asthma rates, we see it with chronic heart disease rates, and then we see how those have become, sort of accelerants for COVID-19 and have led to higher rates in communities that have the highest rates of those diseases. So I think we need to do more around healthcare inequity. We need to do more about the interplay of healthcare inequity and environmental justice, and we need to continue to do more to reduce the cost of care.
Well, one of the other things you're talking about in your agenda so far is access to childcare. It sounds pretty ambitious, but it could have a price tag and even maybe a challenge with getting the workforce to meet the level of demand. How can you do all of those things?
So I think the most exciting thing that I've seen, or one of the most exciting things over the last couple of weeks here, is you've seen the business community come together with advocates, with a coalition of advocates, to recognize that universal childcare is essential to have a modern functioning economy. And to do that, and right to the point that you brought up, right, we need to invest in the workforce for childcare so that it is not poverty wages, but people can make a career out of it. We know that the most important years for child development are 0 to 3. We ought to invest in the workforce that's going to be caring for our kids at that time, especially as our economy continues to require, for the most part, both or at least multiple incomes in a household. right? So childcare is critically important. It's an investment that we have to make. And as someone with two kids under four, right, I know how productive I am or am not if our childcare situation falls away. And it is a broken, fractured system that we need to unify, that we need to invest in, and that we need to raise the standards of.
I got to ask you about the trouble that people are having right now with this website for booking vaccination appointments. It could be a bureaucratic nuisance that we're going to forget about by election time next year. But on the other hand, how big a deal is this, and what would you be able to do differently?
So it's a big deal for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, while there is a lot of COVID-19 that we couldn't have planned for or foresaw, right? We knew that there was going to be a vaccine. We knew that there was going to be a rollout of that vaccine. And we should have had a clear and simple plan to address people's obvious questions that would come up. If you had shown any former legislative staffer a plan that said, we're going to roll out to the population 75 and older, and it's only going to be online, every last one of them would have said, no, you're going to need to have a call center to make that work. And I think we've seen states that have a simple pre-registration website, right? That there has been a far smoother rollout of the vaccine in those states as well. Finally, what we're seeing now is too often we are diverting to mass vaccination sites and we are taking away shots from community-based organizations that have the exact type of trust we need to leverage to make sure that our communities of color, our Black and Brown neighbors who rightly have concerns about vaccination and about the history of medical racism that their community has had to deal with, right? We're taking shots away from the community organizations that are trusted there that we could be leveraging for greater outreach and then have that sense of cultural competency to do that work. So it's beyond frustrating because this is the one thing over the last few years we knew was coming and we could have planned for.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. Stay safe and be well, everybody.
Yes, you too. That was Ben Downing, first Democratic candidate to announce for governor in next year's election.